I used to think monsters were easy to spot. They lurked in alleys, hid in shadows, and came with warning signs you could feel in your bones. I never imagined the real danger would wear soft, perfumed smile across my dining table and call me Mom in a voice sweet enough to rot the air around us. If you had told me that a woman I welcomed into my family would one day try to quietly murder my husband for $4 million, I might have laughed it off as something out of a cheap thriller. But this story isn't a movie. It is the winter I learned that evil can sit in your living room, refill your husband's soup bowl, and tell you she loves him while she poisons him a spoonful at a time. My name is Margaret Lawson, though everyone close to me calls me Maggie, and when all of this began, I was 63 years old, tired from too many flights and too many meetings, yet still proud of the consulting firm I'd built from the ground up. That particular evening, I was driving home from the airport in Dallas after a delayed flight that had me landing hours later than planned. It was close to 6 p.m. when I finally pulled into our driveway and exhaustion pressed down on my shoulders like a loaded coat. The business trip had gone well better than well, actually. I'd just secured a major contract that would keep us comfortable through our retirement, the kind of win you dream of when you're still hustling in your 40s and praying your work will pay off later. I remember thinking how excited I was to tell my husband Henry about it. Maybe open that good bottle of wine we'd been saving and sit out on the back patio the way we used to. But when I stepped out of the car, the first thing that hit me wasn't relief. It was silence. Not the peaceful kind either. Our house in the suburbs of Dallas usually had a low-level hum to it. Rosa, our caregiver, chatting softly in the kitchen. Henry's television turned just a little too loud during his afternoon shows, the rhythmic clink of dishes, or Henry clearing his throat. That evening, there was nothing. The air felt heavy still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. My fingers fumbled with the keys at the front door, and I told myself it was just fatigue that maybe Henry had finally decided to take a proper nap, and Rosa had stepped outside for a moment. But the second I crossed the threshold, a chill slid across my skin. The temperature seemed wrong, the echoes in the hallway a little too sharp. "Henry, I'm home," I called, dropping my carry-on near the entry table. No answer. "Rosa." The sound of my own voice bounced back at me, swallowed up by that strange, sterile quiet. As I walked deeper into the house, the living room came into view, and I halted. It was spotless, more spotless than usual. It looked like a hotel staging like the kind of room you see in glossy magazines, all perfect angles and untouched cushions. Rosa kept our home tidy, but she also lived in it with us. There were always traces of life, a blanket pulled half off the couch. Henry's reading glasses on the coffee table, a mug left to soak by the sink. Now everything had been arranged with almost surgical precision. For the first time, a thin thread of unease tugged at the back of my mind. Footsteps on the stairs snapped me out of it. When I looked up, Brianna appeared at the top landing, descending with that smooth, practiced grace she seemed to carry everywhere. "Oh, Maggie, you're back early," she said, her voice sugar-sweet. She was in her late 20s, blonde hair, perfectly styled, despite the hour lips, glossed clothes, just casual enough to imply comfort, but carefully chosen to flaunt her figure. She had been married to my son Daniel for 2 years by then, and I had spent almost all of that time trying not to flinch every time she called me Mom. I said I'd be back this evening, I replied, not bothering with her attempt at surprise. Up close, I noticed something else, the faint smell of a strong cleaning product clinging to her. Where's Rosa? And where is Henry? Brianna's smile didn't falter, but something tightened briefly around her eyes. "Oh, that," she said, as if I'd asked about the weather. I had to let Rosa go. The expense was just too much, and honestly, Henry and I are managing just fine without her. We're family. I can take care of him just as well as any hired help. Better, actually, because I truly care about him. For a heartbeat, I thought I'd misheard. "You let her go." I repeated slowly, a cold weight dropping into my stomach. Rosa had been with us for 18 months, ever since Henry's heart attack. She knew his schedule, his medications, his moods. She'd celebrated small improvements with us, held my hand when things got scary, laughed with Henry over old stories. You don't just let go of someone like that without a conversation. You don't have the authority to fire her Brianna. I said, my voice low. She tilted her head, almost pitying. Daniel agreed it was best she answered smoothly. We discussed it. You work so many hours, you're never home. Something had to give. I stared at her, and the old instincts I'd honed from decades of negotiating began to whisper in the back of my mind, she's too prepared, too polished, too ready with answers. Where is Henry? I asked, my patience fraying. Resting upstairs, Brianna replied the corners of her mouth, lifting in a soft smile. He's had a rough few days. The change in routine upset him a bit, and he's been very confused lately, more than usual. Those last 3 words pierced me like needles. Confused. More than usual. Henry had experienced some cognitive fog after his heart attack. Yes, but in the past months he'd been stable, even improving. Rosa and I had talked recently. She told me he'd been having more good days than bad. None of this matched what she'd said. Without another word, I moved around Brianna and headed for the stairs. Her presence seemed to cling to the walls as I passed a sweet, suffocating scent. I suddenly wanted to scrub out of the whole house. When I pushed open our bedroom door, the sight waiting for me made my chest ache. Henry lay on the bed, thinner than he'd been 5 days ago when I left Skin, a little ashen eyes closed. "Henry?" I said softly as I approached. His eyelids fluttered, then opened unfocused for a moment. Then recognition dawned and a small, relieved smile tugged at his mouth. "Mags," he whispered voice, raspy but tender. "You're back." I took his hand, startled by how cold and papery his skin felt. "Of course I'm back," I murmured, forcing a smile. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" He glanced toward the doorway and his expression sharpened with a sudden alertness that didn't match the frailty of his body. "Where's Rosa?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Brianna says she let her go." His fingers tightened around mine. "No," he said more firmly than I'd heard him speak in weeks. "That's not right. Rosa wouldn't just leave. She promised she'd be here when you got back." Before I could answer, Brianna's voice drifted from the hallway falsely bright. "I thought I'd make dinner for everyone she called out. It's so nice to have the family together again. Maggie, you must be exhausted from your trip. Why don't you let me take care of everything tonight?" Something in the way. She said those words in the way her sweetness coated the air made every nerve in my body stand on edge. I turned just enough to call back, "That's very thoughtful, Brianna." And as her footsteps retreated, Henry's grip turned urgent, almost painful. He tugged me closer, his voice dropping so low I had to lean in to hear it. "Maggie," he whispered, fear flashing raw in his eyes. "Don't accept anything from her. Don't eat anything she gives you. Don't drink anything. She's been changing my medications. She wants our money, all of it, the $4 million we've saved. She's trying to make me worse." My heart stuttered, then began to pound so loudly I could hear it in my ears. And in that moment, I understood that whatever had been quietly shifting in my home while I was away was far darker than simple family tension. It was a war, and it had already begun. The next morning, long before the sun stretched over the horizon, I woke with Henry's warning echoing through the fragments of restless dreams that had followed me through the night. I found myself lying perfectly still, staring up at the faint outlines of our bedroom ceiling, feeling a strange mix of dread and determination beginning to crystallize inside me. Henry slept beside me, his breathing shallow but steady, though even in that quiet rhythm, I could sense something fragile, something that hadn't been there before I left for Dallas. 5 days. That was all it had taken for him to look like he had aged a year. And suddenly, I knew with absolute clarity that something sinister had been happening in my absence, something deliberate and calculated. His tremors, his pallor, his exhaustion, none of it felt like the natural progression of an illness. It felt engineered as though someone had been controlling the variables of his health, like a scientist with a terrifying experiment. Careful not to disturb him, I eased out of bed and padded downstairs, each step heavier than the last. The house felt wrong again, as though the life had been drained out of it. The silence wasn't comforting. It felt watchful. I switched on the kitchen light and reached for the coffee pot, hoping the familiar routine would ground me. But before I could even pour the water, I heard soft footsteps behind me. When I turned, Brianna stood in the doorway, already dressed in clean jeans and a light sweater hair, curled as though she were preparing for brunch with friends instead of monitoring a sick father-in-law at dawn. "You're up early," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I was going to make breakfast for everyone." She didn't wait for my response before stepping fully into the kitchen, moving with an ease that suggested ownership. She opened cabinets, pulled out ingredients, hummed to herself. I felt myself stiffen as she lifted a carton of eggs and murmured brightly, "You must still be worn out from your trip. Let me handle things today." I forced myself to watch her movements closely, searching for anything out of place. Her gestures were fluid, confident, too confident for someone who was supposedly managing a medical crisis alone. "You mentioned yesterday that Henry's been eating poorly," I said, keeping my tone, even pretending to show interest. "What exactly have you been giving him?" She didn't even glance up. "Simple foods," she replied lightly. "Oatmeal in the morning, soups during the day. He always prefers it when I add honey to his oatmeal. Says it reminds him of when his mother used to make it." The comment made a chill run down my spine, not because of what she said, but because Henry had told me countless times he hated honey and oatmeal. Had she ever once asked him what he actually liked, or had she simply decided she knew better? Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked, "Where did Rosa keep Henry's medication schedule?" It was a question I already knew the answer to, but I needed to hear Brianna's lie. She paused for just a fraction too long, then plastered on a brighter smile. "Oh, I've reorganized all that in my room. I've been very careful to follow the doctor's instructions." My room. As if our guest room had become some kind of command center she now had authority over. Something below the surface in her voice, something brisk and dismissive, made my pulse quicken, with the certainty that this wasn't just incompetence or overstepping. She was hiding something. An hour later, Daniel arrived for his usual morning check-in. His face lit up the moment he saw Brianna bustling around the kitchen. Daniel had always been gentle, trusting earnest. He wanted to see the best in people, even when that best required squinting past glaring red flags. "Morning, Mom," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "How was the trip productive?" I answered deliberately, keeping my voice neutral. "We secured the new contract." He nodded approvingly, but I could tell he was only half listening. His eyes kept drifting back to Brianna, as though she were the sun and he were helplessly orbiting her. "Brianna's been amazing while you were gone," he said with a sincerity that made my chest ache. "She's so good with Dad. Honestly, I don't know what we would have done without her these last few days." I studied my son's face, noting the subtle defensiveness edging into his expression. Brianna had been weaving a narrative one where she was the savior, the caregiver, the dutiful daughter-in-law, and Daniel was swallowing it whole. "Has she?" I asked quietly. "She certainly seems very comfortable making herself at home." The comment landed like a stone. Daniel's jaw tightened, the familiar look of guilt and irritation crossing his features. "Mom, we've talked about this," he said, voice soft but firm. "She's family now. She wants to help. You work constantly, and she's here every day. She's been doing everything she can for Dad." I wanted to scream, "Daniel, open your eyes. Look at Henry. Look closely." But I knew if I pushed too hard, he would retreat further into Brianna's shadow. So instead, I simply nodded and let the moment pass. But inside, something steeled. If Brianna had convinced my son that she alone understood Henry's needs, then I would have to be smarter, quieter, and far more cautious than she ever imagined. Upstairs later that afternoon, when the house had settled into its eerie hush again, Henry sat up in bed and looked at me with a clarity I hadn't seen in days. "Mags," he whispered, reaching for my hand. "Please tell me you're being careful." I sat beside him, letting my fingers wrap around his. "I'm watching her," I said softly. "I'm watching everything she does." He nodded, relief flickering through his eyes. "Good," he murmured. "Because I think she's been going through our papers, our accounts. I caught her in the study twice. She said Daniel told her to organize things, but—" His voice faltered. It didn't feel right. And in that moment, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even realized I was assembling began snapping into place, forming a picture far uglier than I was prepared to see. Something was happening in my house, something calculated, something dangerous, and I knew with a bone-deep certainty that Henry and I were standing at the edge of a precipice. The question was no longer whether Brianna was trying to hurt him. The question was how far she was willing to go. 3 days slipped by like a series of tightly coiled springs, each one wound with tension, each one threatening to snap at any moment. Henry and I had fallen into a silent rhythm, communicating through glances and subtle gestures, pretending everything was normal while we watched Brianna carry out her routines with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. She'd arrive each morning at exactly 8 a.m., with Henry's breakfast always a bowl of oatmeal, whose sweetness Henry forced himself to swallow with a grimace. She would sit on the edge of the bed, her voice soft with counterfeit worry, as she coaxed him through each bite, her fingers brushing his wrist as though she were a tender caregiver. But I noticed the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes every time he struggled to keep the food down. To her, weakness wasn't frightening. It was progress. Each day she made sure to occupy every corner of the house, answering the phone in a tone that suggested she lived there, intercepting mail, comforting Henry with touches that felt more possessive than affectionate, and slowly erasing the patterns of our home and replacing them with her own. But the moment that shattered any remaining doubt came on a Thursday afternoon. Daniel had stopped by for lunch, as he often did, and Brianna insisted on cooking for all of us. She hummed in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, stirring a pot of soup that emitted a rich smell that should have been comforting. But something in its thickness, the faint greenish tint beneath the steam, made my stomach twist. Midway through the meal, I excused myself, claiming I needed the restroom, but instead I walked quietly to the study. The minute I opened the door, my heart sank. The room felt touched. Not violated in a dramatic way, nothing was overturned or obviously rummaged through, but the sense of being tampered with was unmistakable. Papers that had been neatly stacked were now misaligned by mere millimeters. The desk drawers pulled out an inch farther than usual. The faint scent of a perfume I didn't wear laced through the air. I moved straight to the locked drawer where we kept our most important documents. My hand froze. It was no longer locked. I pulled it open slowly, the breath stuck in my throat. The folder that contained our investment portfolio was missing. So were the deed to the lake house and our life insurance policies. In their place lay a single business card, Carter and Doyle Estate Planning Attorneys. My pulse accelerated as I stared at the card, recognizing immediately the kind of firm that specialized in rushed asset transfers and emergency transitions. The kind of place someone would call when they wanted their hands on money fast before anyone had time to ask questions. Just then, footsteps padded down the hallway and I snapped the drawer shut, slipping the card into my pocket. Maggie Brianna's voice floated toward me, syrupy and filled with fabricated concern. "Is everything all right?" I forced my breath to steady, just looking for my reading glasses. I called back, stepping away from the desk. When I returned to the kitchen, she was stirring that strange soup with an almost reverent focus. "This is Henry's lunch," she said, ladling it into a bowl. "He's been digesting this blend better than anything else." I watched her carry the bowl upstairs, my hands trembling, despite my effort to steady them. When Henry took 2 bites, his hands began to shake violently. Sweat rolled down his temples, his breath becoming shallow. Brianna feigned immediate alarm, saying he must have overexerted himself by simply sitting up earlier. And then, with a softness that felt like mockery, she helped him upstairs to lie down, cooing at him as though he were a fussy toddler. When we were finally alone later that night, I told him what I'd found. She's already planning for after I whispered, placing the attorney's card in his hand. He held it between his trembling fingers, his expression darkening into something I recognized from his years at the helm of his company, the fierce calm of a man who had decided he was done being prey. "She's going to kill me," he said quietly, not with panic but with certainty. Not suddenly, slowly, so it looks natural. We knew now that we had only one path forward: expose her. But to expose her, we needed more than suspicion. We needed evidence. Hard, undeniable evidence that couldn't be brushed aside by Daniel or obscured by Brianna's tears. And so we crafted a plan. Henry would act weaker, more confused. He would stumble, forget simple words, collapsing into a version of himself tailored to Brianna's expectations. If she believed her scheme was working, she might become careless. And while she reveled in her illusion of control, I would install hidden cameras around the house, tiny, discreet, nearly invisible, to catch her every move. When the cameras arrived 2 days later, disguised inside a flower delivery, my hands shook as I positioned each one. In the kitchen, above the stove. In Henry's bathroom, facing the medicine cabinet. In the study, angled toward the desk. Henry kept watch while I worked, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and dread. "Are you sure?" he asked softly as I secured the final device. "It has to work," I whispered, even though my heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The next few days were a study in horror. The footage revealed Brianna crushing unmarked pills into Henry's breakfast oatmeal each morning. The bathroom camera showed her swapping his legitimate medications with small round white pills from an unlabeled bottle. But the worst moment came from footage 2 days later when she added a clear liquid from a tiny vial into his soup. I zoomed in on the label until the words came into focus: digitalis extract, a plant-based toxin lethal in the wrong doses. A switch flipped inside me, then something primal and fierce. She wasn't just hurting him, she was killing him. I called Rosa that night. Her number had been changed, but through an old neighbor I managed to reach her at her sister Elena's house. When she answered, her voice broke in relief. "Mrs. Lawson?" "I've been so worried," she said. I told her everything, my voice shaking as I described the footage. She fell silent for a long moment, then confessed she had seen Brianna tampering with Henry's pills before she was fired. And when she tried to contact me, Brianna had told her I had changed my number and didn't want staff calling me directly. "She's dangerous," Rosa whispered. "I didn't know how to warn you." When I hung up, I went to Henry. We sat together in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, our hands intertwined, our breathing synced. We had enough now. Enough to destroy her, enough to protect him, enough to wage the final battle for our family. But as we plotted the next steps, Henry looked at me with unshakable resolve and said, "I think it's time we give her what she wants just for a moment." And though the idea terrified me more than anything else, I knew he was right. We would stage a collapse, and we would see what Brianna did when she believed she'd finally succeeded. The morning we chose for Henry's staged collapse arrived with an eerie stillness, as though the house itself sensed what was coming. I remember waking before sunrise, lying beside him in the dimness, listening to his breath, and trying not to imagine how close we had come to losing him for real. He reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently, and whispered, "Don't look so worried, Mags. I'm still here." I tried to smile, but fear clung to me like a second skin. We rehearsed every detail one last time: the timing, the signals, the placement of the hidden camera in the living room. Everything needed to unfold naturally, or Brianna would suspect something. When the clock struck 10:30 a.m., I grabbed my keys and told Brianna I was heading out for groceries. She barely looked up from her phone, offering a cheerful drive safe, as though she weren't actively working toward my husband's slow, calculated death. At the grocery store, every second stretched uncomfortably. I paced the cereal aisle, checking my phone over and over, waiting for the signal. At 10:58 a.m., the phone rang. The house number flashed on the screen. My heart lurched. When I answered, Brianna's panicked voice broke through in shaky breaths. "Maggie, you need to come home right now. Something's wrong with Henry." Her tone, frantic and cracking, might have fooled anyone else, but I had grown far too familiar with her rehearsed panic. "What happened?" I said, abandoning my cart and rushing for the exit. "He collapsed," she cried. "He was sitting in the living room and grabbed his chest. He's pale. I don't know what to do." "Did you call 911? I asked sharply. Silence, one beat, two, then a thin wavering "I wanted to call you first. I know how much you worry about him being rushed to the hospital." That pause told me everything. A normal person panics, calls for help, not Brianna. She waited, calculated, ensured enough time would pass to make this collapse fatal. And if Henry hadn't been pretending, it might have been. "Call the ambulance now," I said, and hung up before she could argue. I sped home, my pulse roaring in my ears. But as I reached our street, something was horribly off. No ambulance, no flashing lights, no responders rushing in with medical bags. I threw my car into park and ran into the house. The moment I crossed the threshold, I could hear Brianna whimpering softly. I found her in the living room, kneeling beside Henry's chair, one hand on his arm as though she'd been there all along. Henry lay slumped over, breathing shallowly, his face impressively ashen. For a terrifying heartbeat, I felt my chest seize. What if something had gone wrong? What if he had pushed too hard? But the moment I touched his hand, I felt it the faintest squeeze. Relief washed through me so intensely that my knees nearly buckled. "Where is the ambulance?" I asked, my voice trembling. Brianna looked up, her eyes glossy. "They said it would be 20 minutes. I've been trying to help him, but he won't wake up properly." 20 minutes. That was a lie. In our neighborhood, emergency response never took more than 8. Henry opened his eyes slowly, blinking at me with perfectly executed confusion. "Mags, what happened?" he whispered, voice frail. We heard sirens approaching at last, but when Brianna's eyes darted toward the sound, her expression shifted for just a moment. Something like disappointment flickered behind her worry. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by another choked sob. Paramedics rushed in, assessed Henry, and recommended immediate transport. Through it all, Brianna hovered, wringing her hands, acting distraught, yet careful to ensure she never actually got in the paramedics' way. At the hospital, Dr. Peter Lang examined Henry with his usual thoroughness. Hours earlier, I had already called him to discuss our concerns. When I showed him the camera footage and photos of digitalis, his professional composure cracked, revealing alarm. "Mrs. Lawson," he said quietly, "digitalis poisoning. Could have killed him within days. You did the right thing acting when you did." When the blood work results came back the next morning, confirming the presence of digitalis, I felt both vindicated and sickened. Real poison. In his bloodstream. Brianna stayed close the entire day, clutching Henry's hand and whispering, "Please get better," in a trembling voice that made my skin crawl. She even brought him coffee, bland, harmless hospital coffee, to maintain the act. But whenever she thought I wasn't looking, she slipped out into the hallway for hushed phone calls. I noticed her checking her burner phone more than her regular one. I caught glimpses of her expression shifting when doctors mentioned Henry's improvement. A tightening of the jaw, the flicker of something cold, especially when Dr. Lang said Henry might be discharged in a day or two. Her face almost sagged with disappointment before she masked it with another tearful nod. When Daniel arrived that evening, he rushed into the room, horror and guilt flooding his features when he saw his father hooked to monitors. He clung to Brianna, thanking her for everything she'd done. I watched them quietly, my heart breaking for my son, who had become a puppet on the strings Brianna wove around his conscience. But now that we had evidence, hard, undeniable proof, it was time to show him the truth. The next morning, I asked Daniel to step into the hallway. "Sweetheart," I began softly, "I need you to listen with an open mind." His expression tightened. "Mom, if this is about Brianna—" "It is," I said. "But this isn't suspicion anymore, this is evidence." I handed him the lab results. He frowned down at the numbers. "This could be an error," he murmured, but his voice was already unsteady. Gently, I placed the printed screenshots from the hidden cameras into his hands. The crushed pills, the vial labeled digitalis extract, the substitution of medications. His face drained of color. "No," he whispered. "No, she wouldn't. She loves him." "Daniel," I said, placing my hand over his look again. With trembling fingers, I gave him the final piece photos of the burner phone conversation I'd discovered in her nightstand. Messages between Brianna and someone named Calvin Price. How much longer soon? He's weak. Maybe a week. Good. Buyer is impatient. Handle the old woman if needed. Daniel stepped back as though struck. His knees buckled, one hand bracing against the wall. "Mom, what have I done?" I gathered him into my arms. "What anyone would do," I whispered. "You trusted the wrong person, but we're going to fix this. Together." Later that afternoon, Henry was discharged. On the drive home, Detective Laura Reyes and her partner followed discreetly, ready for the sting. When we walked through the door, Brianna had staged a fake celebration. A homemade dinner, flowers, a welcome home Henry banner. The audacity of it nearly stole my breath. She fussed over Henry, placing a tray of soup beside him. Her voice dipped in honey as she said she had new supplements from Dr. Monroe, a doctor who, as Daniel had already discovered, didn't exist. Henry pushed the pills away. "I think I'll wait for Dr. Lang," he murmured. Her mask slipped. A flash of irritation, of calculation. Daniel stepped forward, voice steady. "What's Dr. Monroe's full name?" Her smile strained. "Eric Monroe. He's a specialist downtown." "Funny," Daniel said, pulling out his phone. "There's no Dr. Monroe in any cardiac clinic in this city." The room fell silent. Then everything happened at once. Brianna's expression hardened, her voice dropping its sweetness. "You have no idea what you're getting into," she hissed. Reaching into her purse, she grabbed her burner phone and barked, "Calvin, we have a problem, they know." That was my cue. I pressed the panic button Detective Reyes had given me, and within seconds the front door burst open. Brianna staggered back as Detective Reyes strode in. "Brianna Cole Lawson, you are under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy to commit fraud." The shock on Brianna's face curdled into rage. "You'll regret this," she spat as the cuffs clicked shut. "Calvin won't let this go. Calvin Price is already in custody," Detective Reyes replied calmly. "We picked him up an hour ago." 3 months later, standing on the deck of our lake house with Henry's arm wrapped around my waist, the setting sun painting the water gold, I realized survival changes you in ways recovery never can. Henry's health returned almost completely once the toxins left his body. His spirit rekindled faster than I expected. Daniel filed for divorce the next day after the arrest. He is healing too slowly, painfully, but honestly. We rehired Rosa immediately. When she hugged Henry the first time she saw him, after everything, she cried like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. 1 year later, Henry and I renewed our vows in a small ceremony overlooking the lake. As the wind carried the scent of pine across the water and Daniel walked me down the aisle, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Henry slipped a simple band onto my finger, engraved with the date we saved each other, and whispered, "Thank you for fighting for us." I held his hand and whispered back, "Thank you for surviving with me." And this time, as we began our first dance as a twice-married couple, the world felt safe again, not because danger didn't exist, but because we had learned that love, when defended with courage and clarity, could survive even the darkest of betrayals. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in my place? And have you ever trusted someone who revealed a side you never imagined? If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel.